Well, with the situation around the Financial Action Task Force and the concerns around corruption in our society, we're still waiting to see how government and President Cyril Ramaphosa will properly and fully implement the findings of the Zondo Commission. Meanwhile, other organizations have been looking at how to avoid this kind of state capture corruption in the future, and particularly around procurement, which we understand is still a major issue. Khadijah Ameen is with the consultants Kearney. Khadijah, good afternoon to you. I mean, we've seen the procurement scandals during the state capture saga. We saw it again during the pandemic. How do you believe we can set up a system to stop this kind of corruption?
Good afternoon, Stephen, and thanks for having me. I think what is fundamental for us to understand is really the criticality and importance that public procurement plays within the South African landscape. It effectively allows us to ensure that taxpayers see the value for their money, and it's really important for us to establish a foundation and a framework that allows for robust governance within the public procurement environment as well.
It's one thing to set up systems. I mean, are the systems the problem? Or are the people the problem? Because we keep adding law after layer after layer. And I understand why we do that, you know. Pass a law, fix the problem, but we don't fix the problem.
I think it's important to highlight that within South Africa we have a very comprehensive set of legislation and regulations in place to govern public procurement. And while that's really all well and good in terms of the requirements that we have to put in place, we've seen many of these challenges and events that you've highlighted with respect to irregular expenditure in spite of this. And the approach and the philosophy that we believe is that over-regulation and adopting a purely rules-based approach has not been effective in the past, and we don't anticipate that it will be effective in the future. And ultimately what we've ended up with is a system where we have significant non-compliance in spite of these rules and regulations, but added to that severe inefficiencies in our public organizations, which then ultimately leads to further negative impact for the public. So to your point, the philosophy fundamentally needs to change. And I think while the core principles that we have laid down in legislation are really critical and important to guide us, the framework, not just in terms of how we define it, but also in terms of how we operationalize and action it, is really, really important. And this is where we've really tried to understand what would be effective in these environments. And from our experience, what we've seen is there's fundamental elements around the way we establish our control mechanisms, the way we ensure that our decision-making is structured in a manner that allows for distributed accountability, but also empowers all levels across the organization to focus on procurement where it really matters and ready for tactical and strategic procurement to ultimately be executed in the most effective and efficient manner.
Is it difficult to do? And I mean, I'm going to come back to the politics question because I think we can't get away from it. But it's actually, I mean, sometimes it seems impossible to have a proper system. I mean, I want to bang my head on the table every time I see a story about Tembisa Hospital, for example.
It's not impossible to do, but it's going to be a journey. And I think what we really need to understand is where we are today. There is a lot of rebuilding that needs to be done. And what our point is really is that it starts from laying the right sort of approach and philosophy and foundation at the core. And we've seen it implemented effectively in certain elements of organizations, particularly in this space where efficiencies have been realized. But we do understand that it's still a journey and it needs full support from the highest levels to ensure that it's operated or implemented in an effective way.
You make the point that it needs to come from the highest levels, and this takes us really back to the politics. I mean, time and time again, an Auditor General has used the phrase consequence management pretty much throughout the entire report that they've issued. And that comes from the top. I mean, we see it in councillors, and I'm reminded, in fact, of a quote that Cyril Ramaphosa, the President, used. He said, when speaking at the ANC's policy conference, talking about councils, he quoted the COGTA Minister, Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma, when he said, the problem is us, the ANC. I mean, an amazing thing to say. In a sense, I wonder if this is a political problem, and not just an ANC problem, but a political problem. If you don't have the people at the top actually living up to it. I mean, you know, if we don't have people actually instituting consequence management, nothing will change.
So I really think we need to approach this a little bit more holistically. So there is definitely the politics behind it that we can't get away from and that I cannot really necessarily get into or speak to. But I think what's really important in terms of what we've tried to implement and embed in organizations is this concept of proactive compliance management so that we avoid this consequence management having to come from the top. So how do we embed the right sets of controls proactively as an organization across the procurement value chain? And how do we distribute those responsibilities and accountabilities to ensure that it's organic and it comes from within the organization? Because I think while we have this color or painting of our landscape being quite riddled with corruption and these negative aspects, I think it's important for us not to forget that there have been pockets of excellence within these really robust and stringent requirements across several state-owned enterprises, which we don't really talk about. So I think it's important for us to leverage and celebrate some of these pockets of excellences, but also leverage and build upon those to really adopt this proactive approach to compliance management so that as SOEs, we don't end up in a situation where we actually need to be dealt with from a consequence management perspective top down.
I mean, you've got to change an approach. Is there a cultural change you have to implement as well? I mean, sometimes an organization or institution can develop a culture over time. Go around the world and you will find people who complain that a government department's never as efficient as the private sector.
And I think that there will always be that challenge in terms of the balance between public and private sector and the inefficiencies. I mean, at the end of the day, it's a very sensitive topic when we speak within the context of public procurement, because ultimately we're accountable to our taxpayers for every cent and rand that we spend. Similarly, in the private sector, yes, the shareholders are holding you accountable. But I think at the end of the day, it's important for us to think about what sort of philosophy we want to embed across the organization. And what we've seen is when you really empower decision-making throughout the organization, the culture starts to transform slowly as individuals who are really doing your day-to-day procurement and sourcing activities feel that they actually have a place and they actually have a voice in terms of being able to conduct service delivery in an efficient manner. And I think we always, in terms of the negative instances or examples in terms of what we've seen in the space, we focus a lot on sort of the concentrated elements or the powers that has happened in terms of the corruption. But ultimately, I think we need to look at the broader organization, and it's really the sum of its parts at the end of the day. And if we can embed that culture from the bottom all the way to the top, I think it can slowly but surely be embedded and permeate itself across the organization as a whole.
Khadijah Ameen from Kearney, really appreciate the time and the thoughts. Thanks very much indeed.